Today I want to talk about chord progressions. As I was thinking about how to present chord progressions, I was like, okay, I could show you a whole bunch of really common progressions and, I could give you some examples, but you can find that anywhere. Just search common chord progressions. I thought what we could do here instead is look more in detail on what makes chord progressions even possible, how different chords can come to be linked together and to form one whole progression. So not just this chord and that chord and that chord, but why do they sound together? Like, what brings these things together? What are the relationships, in other words, between the chords that allow us to hear them as a progression in the first place? And I think that's the most interesting question for music theory in some sense. Why do we hear it as one flowing thing, not just this chord and then this chord and then this chord? And, some chords work better than others connecting to each other. So why is that? Can we talk about that? Do we have the tools to say something interesting about that? And I think we do. So for today, I'm actually just going to talk about two chords and how they, through their history of extremely common use, became linked together, so closely linked together that they're a perfect example of how two chords can become linked in this way and flow in and out of each other in really interesting ways, and which show those potential connections between chords. So when we look at just the 1 and the 5 chord, you might hear it and say, oh, this sounds classical, this sounds kind of dull. This is not really something I myself would write as a chord progression, right? Because it sounds old-fashioned. But yeah, that's not what I'm here for. So what I'm looking again is at those connections between these chords. How do these chords relate to one another such that they can sound like they can create a gesture together or create a feeling of a progression? And then we could maybe abstract from what we learn. So without regard to these individual chords, right, we can just look at how these connections work, and then we can extract what we learned from that and apply it in principle to any combinations of chords. And that's where the really fun part comes in, because of course when you're crafting your own piece, when you're making when you're composing, it's very subjective. There's no formula I can give you to say this chord should follow this chord should follow this chord. All I can do is show you what has happened in the past and these patterns, these relationships that are formed, and then we can abstract from them. We can ignore these individual chords and say, well, that's interesting. What did we learn about the relationships formed, and how can we think about forming our own connections between chords in our own piece if we're composing, or analyzing others and how others have done it? Just to dive in, tonic and dominant, we've seen before, right? The chords, they're simple triads, 1 and 5. But a really important thing is that when I'm talking about the 1 chord and the 5 chord, this is all within the realm of what's called tonality. And tonality, or tonal music, is just an umbrella term for music that is centered around or in a key. And so most of the music that we've looked at in this course is tonal in a broad sense, which, is different from diatonic. Remember that diatonic meant just the notes of the key. But tonality is, you can be in C major, you can be in D minor, any one of the 24 major and minor keys, and you can include chromatic notes, non-diatonic notes, especially as, like, for example, we saw non-chord tones and things like that. You can have chromatic notes and not disturb the sense of the overall sense of being in a key. So tonality is just that umbrella term. It includes diatonic and chromatic music. It's just, if you overall feel like you're in a key, that's tonality. And the 1-5-1 is a really crucial part of tonality. They actually really became some of the main key defining chords. And why do I say that? Well, it actually works both ways, right? If I'm in a key, then I know that this is the 1 chord, and vice versa. If I'm calling this the 1 chord, it means I'm referring to it in the context of a key, right? Because 1 means scale degree 1 in the key of whatever key I'm in. That is, scale degree 1 is also the tonic, right? So when I say tonic and dominant, or tonality, you can hear that same word in there, tonic. Tonality is just being in a key. The 1 chord is the chord of the root of that key. And then the dominant, the 5 chord, is not the opposite, but sort of like another pole. Tonic, scale degree 1, has a certain feeling to it, a sense of stability, a sense of home, if you will. And then dominant has another feeling, like a sense of being away from the tonic and some motion that's going to imply that we're going to go back to home, back to tonic. This relationship between 1, 5, and 1 is actually crucial to tonality. And I say relationship again because it's not these chords themselves so much as the way that they connect together, the way that they relate to each other and form a key or form a gesture or something. Good, so let's dive in. Let's look at some notes. So I've written out here the 1 chord and then the 5 chord and then the 1 chord again. And I'm just in C major here, but I could be in any key. And there you have it. It's 1, 5, 1. Nice and simple. As we explore the relationships between these two chords and what we can learn from them in order to understand chord progressions more broadly, we'll see that these last two, just 5 and 1, form a really close relationship, even closer than the overall 1, 5, 1, because that ending of 5 and 1 does just that. It creates a sense of an ending. It sounds like this is the end of something. It sounds like it's finishing. This chord, that's not the end. It's not done. Something else. There we go, right? Yeah, so that's coming to some kind of conclusion. Well, how is that working? It's one thing I want to explore, and it's ending on the 1 chord, which will establish the sense of C major overall. And we'll explore very shortly, the relationships between those two chords and how they get that feeling across of that sense of closure or that sense of motion and then that sense of rest. So similarly, if that's the ending gesture, then the first chord can act as an opening gesture. And I'm calling these gestures because we get the sense that the 1 chord could start something new, right? You can start the piece that way, and then you can wander, you can go anywhere you'd like. And then when you get here, that's the 5 chord. So however you got there, then you'd get to your ending gesture. So after your opening gesture, you have the 1 chord, and then where I put the squiggly green line, it's like you can have anything in there. You could have not just other notes, but other chords altogether. Go and visit some other harmonies. But then when you get here, there's the 5 chord, there's the 1 chord. That could be the end. And so in tonal music, in classical music and other kinds of genres that are broadly tonal, you'll find that this is a really common way to have a beginning gesture, some kind of 1 chord that expresses itself out, and then a closing or an ending gesture, which would be the 5 to 1 at the very end. So if this was the opening gesture, then your closing gesture sort of encapsulates the whole piece in that key. Good, so I hope you can already see, this is an example of where we might learn something about the relationships between these chords that then we could, without needing to use these specific triads, the 1 and the 5 chord, we could use any chords, but we could think about how they create gestures. I think gesture is actually a really good way of thinking about harmony in general. A chord or a series of chords connect together and are able to express a higher level concept, something like motion or rest or opening or closing, ending, any number of things. And it's hard to express in language, right? You have to kind of figure this out on your own. So play around with these, see if you can make harmonic gestures, connections between chords that, you might not expect. Once again, the gesture will arise from the connection that these chords have together, how they relate to each other. As we've found over the course of this class, nothing in music happens on its own. Music is that whole context. Everything is in relationships. So the 1 chord, you don't just have music that's just the 1 chord. It's in relationship to other things. It's in a context. Same with the 5 chord. And those contexts, those relationships are how we form gestures and things like that. Good. So I said we're not so concerned with what the chords are themselves. We could in principle use anything. But in this case, let's just review what these chords are themselves. The C major chord, right, is C, then E, C, and I've just spelled it out this way because, it could be another way, but this is a simple way, nice and easy to see. And you see I have scale degree 1 here, 3, 5, and 1. So I've doubled the 1 to extra emphasize that sense of this is C major, this is where we're starting out. And then just to review what the 5 chord is, the 5 chord has scale degree 5. And it's coming from this chord, right? G, B, D, scale degree 5, 7, and 2. And then if I spell it out, G down here, then D, then G, and then B again, G again, and then B, and that's scale degree 5, back to 1. So you can already notice something interesting between these two chords just from the scale degrees, right? Is that G, the second note from the top, scale degree 5, is in both the 1 chord and the 5 chord. So that note actually can just stay there the whole time. And the other notes move relative to it, right? It's kind of interesting because there's a lot of motion between these chords, but that note is just staying the same. I think the thing to really pay attention to when we're talking about how chords relate to each other, how they connect together, is not so much, I mean, we should know what the chords are themselves, but as I've been saying, not so much what they are vertically, but thinking about the other dimension of harmony that we've talked about, right? Not just up and down, like this chord, then this chord, then this chord, but how the voices connect together. And it's something that we've talked about before, but I think it's really important to see in any harmonic progression to think about that horizontal aspect of harmony. So again, I'm going to be talking about voice motions, the soprano in the top, the alto, then the tenor, and then the bass. And those are just arbitrary. You could have 5 voices, 6 voices, but it's easy to keep track if you just have 4, and then we can call it the alto, the tenor, and the bass, and so forth. So when we're looking at these voice motions and we're trying to figure out about how chords connect together, and we're talking about how we can analyze the way that chords connect together, what kinds of relationships they form, it's going to be helpful to have certain classifications of certain kinds of motion. And I think these are just some really helpful terms for thinking about voice motions. So parallel is a term we use for when two voices, and again, these are just how voices move relative to each other, not just on their own, but in relationships. So we've got two voices and they're moving exactly the same amount up, exactly the same amount down. If one goes up, then the other one goes up. If one goes down, the other one goes down. That's going to be called parallel if they're moving in the same amount. So you can think about notes that are moving in thirds. We would call this parallel thirds. Now, a very similar thing would be two voices that are moving in the same direction but by different amounts, and that will be called similar motion. So you could have one voice moving up a lot and one voice just moving up by step. So this voice will move up by a third and this voice moves up by a step. And then this voice will move up by a third and this will move up by a step. Up by a lot. And similar motion, one voice moves up a little bit, one voice moves up a lot, one voice moves down a little bit, one voice moves down a lot. Kind of like parallel, but just less specific to staying on the same interval. Oblique motion is another form of motion where one voice stays steady and then another voice moves relative to it against it. So you can imagine this would be like music with a drone. If you have one note that's playing the whole time and you have another voice that's moving in motion against it, this would be an example of oblique motion. One voice was just staying on the same note the whole time, and the other voice was moving against it. The last way that voices can relate to each other in forms of motion like this is as contrary motion. So this is just obviously if one voice goes up, the other voice goes down, and vice versa. And contrary motion can also create really interesting effects, like two voices that are dissonant with each other, like a tritone moving to something consonant. Or, as we'll see, two different voices that move to the same note but in different directions. They both land on D, but they move away from each other to get there. And that's an example of contrary motion. As we'll see, these voice motions are really useful for discovering the relationships between chords and how different voices move relative to each other and connect the different chords together so that we hear it as a chord progression. So that was contrary motion. So if we look again at our harmonies here, the 1 and the 5, and the motions of the voices between them, we can start to analyze these. We can start to think about, okay, how do these motions contribute to the overall sound of the progression of what we're hearing? And in order to get into that, I want to discuss one more terminology thing, which is that we call some notes here tendency tones. And they're called tendency tones because they have this tendency to move in a certain way, or for the voice to move in a certain way. And what is a tendency? A tendency is literally just an expectation that we have because of a history of listening, because these chords were used so commonly in this way for so long, in so many different composers over different eras, different genres are using these chords chords, they, through that history of listening, establish an expectation in our minds that we think, okay, when we hear this in this context, we're thinking it's going to resolve in a certain way. It has a tendency to move that way. Tendency is not a law or not a rule, right? You can do whatever, you can break these, but that expectation is probably going to be there in your listeners, and I think it's good to know so that you can play with the expectation, and we'll come back to that. So the strongest and clearest example of a tendency tone is scale degree 7, and we also call scale degree 7 the leading tone. Why is it called the leading tone? Because it leads back to tonic. Leading tone. And if I stop the scale there, you're left expecting something because the leading tone has a tendency to move up by half step. We are waiting for that last note to happen. And same thing happens when the leading tone is used in a chord. So in the context of the 5 chord, you can hear that leading tone in the melody getting ready to move up by step. And when it does, we complete the gesture. In other words, when you satisfy that expectation, it'll go from the sense of motion, which we had when we were having the expectation during the 5 chord. We're hearing this like, okay, we expect it to have, that's why it doesn't feel finished when you're here, but it does when you return from 5 back to 1. Now, if we look at the voice motion, right, we can see that that is actually moving in parallel with the tenor voice. So if we take those two together, we've got E and C, going down to D and B, and then coming back to E and C. And that's moving in what we would call parallel sixths, because it's a sixth E to C, a sixth from D to B, and a sixth again from E to C. If we look actually at the soprano and the alto voice, we should notice that those are moving obliquely to each other, because G is there, as we talked about, G is there the whole time. So then when we add the soprano voice back in over the G, we can see that the soprano voice moves while the alto voice stays steady on G. Obliquely to the G. In fact, as you can see, all of the voices move obliquely to that G, right? Because if that voice is staying still, we can explore how all these different voice motions move relative to it. And you can hear these different aspects of the overall harmony. And I think it's so important to be able to do this, to pull apart the overall harmony. Say, what are those individual motions that are contributing to that overall sense of the feeling that 5/1 gives? So the last thing that's going to be really crucial to consider there is the bass motion, the falling fifth in the bass. And this is the motion from 5 down to 1. That motion in the bass from 5 down to 1, which, notice, is in contrary motion with the tendency tone, the leading tone, that's resolving up to the tonic. And that contrary motion landing on the same note an octave apart from C to C. So the fifth falls in the bass down to the tonic, and then the leading tone in the melody goes up to the tonic. That contrary motion also contributes to the sense of here's some movement. And then when it lands here, it pushes out in both directions and lands on that note. You're like, this is the final note. That's my tonic. And I'm back home in C major. Okay, so that was some important voice motions and how these chords come together and why they sound the way they do. You can imagine even having them arranged in other ways. You could have inversions and have other kinds of spellings, just putting other notes in there and whatever, but that you could still kind of hear some of those voice motions in there, some of those tendencies, whether or not you choose to go with the tendency or to do something else. And I hope you're also abstracting and thinking, okay, even if I wasn't just using the 1 and the 5 chord, because it sounds kind of classical, it's not something I would maybe use in my own composition, but I'm able to see how the relationships formed between the voices contribute to the overall sense of the progression. The ending gesture that we talked about is also called a cadence, and cadence was something we talked about in melody, because harmony, just like melody, has certain resting points of the spirit, has to come to a close at some point. The cadence gesture is just that. Remember that cadence comes from a word which means fall, or to fall to a close, kind of falling to a close. And especially with the falling fifth in the bass, that sort of makes sense. The end. So that's the closing gesture. Now we can see that that contrary motion, the leading tone going up and the falling fifth in the bass, is really important in this cadential motion. And we'll see that in a sec in some of the examples I'm going to give. Okay, yeah, here's some examples. So this first example is in A major. It starts off with the one chord and running around some 16th notes, and then we see a cadence at the end. And we can see at the very end there a clear 5-1 cadence. It's just those chords. I've highlighted now, you can see the tendency tones that we talked about. The leading tone, in this case G sharp going up by half step to A, is up here. 7-1. It's kind of concealed by these other notes, but it's in there. So you can hear the amidst the 5-1 in the other voice. Right? Going up a fourth. And then you can see that the same 5-1, the falling fifth, is in the left hand, underneath this chord, right? 5-1. So yeah, super classical, but the essence of it is that these motions contribute to the sense of finality that's built into this really old chord progression that gives us an example of how chords can come to be connected to each other. Let's take another example in F major. Here we start on a chord that is maybe not so obviously the one chord, right? Here we have some other notes. B flat is scale degree 4, G is scale degree 2. So we're coming from somewhere else, and that's okay, because remember at the beginning I had that opening gesture, then the green squiggle. It's like anything can go in there, as long as then it comes to a close with the closing gesture. We're starting here on B flat with a trill. So we're not really sure where this is going yet. But then right here, okay, it's like, yeah, there's the cadence that clearly shows that we're in F major. And you can see that the 5 chord lands on the 1 chord, and then there's an extra lower bass note F that comes in to kind of doubly confirm the 1 chord. So you can see in the right hand, the leading tone is up there in the highest voice. 7-1. And then in the left hand, you can see the falling fifth. There's actually first it is a rising fourth, right? 5-1, but then it kind of completes the whole gesture by hitting that low one anyways. Just to doubly convince you, yeah, that's the ending on F. Okay, here's another one. This one's actually in minor, and this one's leaping back a little bit further in history. We're starting on 1/6 this time. So the first inversion of the 1 chord, which is kind of cool. It shows another possible variation. And we can see that in minor, we're going to have some changes to the 5 chord, which I'll talk about in just a second. So when the 5 chord comes in here in D minor, our 5 chord is A, C sharp, and E. And then that's going to go back to D minor. But the C sharp, you know, is added. We'll get to that in a sec. There's also another note there. We can see that F comes in. So is that in the 5 chord? Well, no. So that is a non-chord tone, and we actually can recognize this one. It's an incomplete neighbor tone. It doesn't quite finish the job of being a neighbor to E. Like, it seems like it could come back, right? 5 chord. And then it goes up to F. And we can see that if it did that, it would be a full neighbor and then land here. But instead, it kind of goes up and then disappears. So it's an incomplete neighbor. It just doesn't return to E, but it's still decorating that chord. So we don't need to worry too much about the F. We still get this cadence, the 5-1. And we should also note the voice motions, same as we had in major, but crucial scale degree 7, or the third of the 5 chord in D minor. Normally the 5 chord would be A, C, E. Because D minor has just C natural, so when you have the 5 chord, it would normally be A, C, E, but it needs to be modified. In this case, why does it get modified? Why do we add the sharp? Well, the sharp is actually turning the C, scale degree 7, is turning just the plain old C into the leading tone, which is a raised scale degree 7, which is then just half step below tonic, or 1, so that can move in that same voice motion that we had, scale degree 7 moving up by half step in major. And that's why we call this harmonic minor. As we talked, it's harmonic because scale degree 7 is raised in order to make the 5 chord major and create those same relationships between 5 and 1 that we had in the major, except now with a minor 1. So you can see how that works there, and then you have the double falling 5th in the bass. A little bit calmer of a cadence. For a less calm cadence, this one is a little bit more brash, a little bit more loud. Also in minor, this one's in C minor this time. Here we can see that we get actually doubled up. We have 1 5 1 and then 5 1 again. So this one starts on C, and then goes to the 5 chord, and then goes back to C minor, but then that's not done yet. We get that big cadence gesture at the end. Grand gesture where you fling your hands up in the air after you're done. So that's the cadence right there at the end. We see throughout that the 5 chord, just like in the last example, has been modified. The natural sign here is doing the same thing that the sharp sign was doing in the last example. It's taking B and making B natural, which is the leading tone in C minor. So it's raising the third of the 5 chord until it's B natural, and then making that the leading tone, which pushes up to C and establishes C minor in this cadence gesture. So that the first time it happens, it's kind of like, well, this is an example of some other chords that could be in between 1 and 5 at the beginning. You know, you could have 1 5 1 5 1, or as we'll see in the future, of course, you could fit in principle anything in there and still have a tonally closed piece where you open with your 1 chord and close with your cadence like 5 1 or some other kind of cadence. The essence here isn't to just repeat these exact chords, of course, but is to figure out, like, yeah, how can we create original relationships like these between chords and our own progressions and patterns like that. And we see these voices are moving in exactly the same way we saw in the previous examples, but now actually doubled, so that we have 2 leading tones. Oops, I meant to C major, but you know, it's the same thing. There's the C minor version. And you can hear that B is emphasized there, B natural, leading up to C. Same thing in the bass. You get the contrary motion going down, the big falling 5th in octave. And if you play those two together, you get that closing gesture. Good. So those were some examples of just simple 5 1 1 5 1. Here's actually 1 5 1. One last variation I want to do on this. The 5 chord really commonly gets a note added to it, gets a 7th, because as I talked about earlier, the 1 chord in this case is sort of representing stability. It's the key that we're in. It's the home chord, the tonic. Then the 5 chord is sort of representing motion or somewhere else, and that's going to want to come back. That's going to want to return to the key. And adding a 7th pushes in even more, adds even more movement and motion into the 5 chord. That creates even stronger sense of relaxation or rest when we get back to 1. So let's just take a look quick at how that works, because it's so common, like I said. The 5 chord often gets this extra note added in, the 7th, in this case F above G, so that we'll have this kind of sound. And as you hear that 2nd chord now, the 5 chord, instead of doubling the G, I have now another note, F, so 4 different notes. I have a 7th chord, a complete 7th chord, which maybe you can feel that little extra motion in it, that little extra push, a little extra crunch. That's going to push back towards C major chord. So it's a subtle difference, but it's such a common addition that I thought we would talk about the 5-7 as well. First, I also rearranged something else about this. So when you hear this version, now you might hear a different melody up here in the melody of 3. So see if you can hear that. And you can see that that moves now in parallel with the alto voice or the 2nd voice. They move in parallel thirds. So you can have this kind of like 3 1 2 7 1, which is kind of cool. They move down in thirds and then they collapse in together on 1 there. So now we can see that there is actually no more oblique motion, because the G that was staying stationary the whole time in the previous version is gone, and now all three of the upper voices are moving. So that's why this one, as I said, when you add a seventh to the 5 chord, it's got a little bit more possibility for motion in it. And what's the tendency, or what's the typical expectation for that motion? Well, it's for scale degree 4, which is the 7th above the 5 chord. If we look at the G chord, the 5 chord, 5, 7, 2, 4, in C major, that's scale degree 4, right? F. So we're expecting that scale degree 4 to resolve down by step, usually, to scale degree 3. And actually that goes for chordal sevenths in general, that when you have a seventh on a chord, very often the tendency is for it to move down by step into the next chord, but it doesn't have to. That's just, again, a pretty common expectation or tendency that you can play with and feel free to explore on your own, or try and figure out how to set up a new tendency in your music. And that contributes to, again, a little bit more motion in the 5 chord going into the cadence. So let's take a look at one final example. This wraps up a few things, I think, in a really interesting way. Look at that melody. Look at that upper line. All those chromatic notes. Now, it says we're in C sharp minor, but half of those notes aren't in C sharp minor. Is that going to disturb our sense of key? Well, maybe if this was out of context, if we just had this melody, yeah, we wouldn't really know what key we're in because it's just chromatic. But the cadence at the end, the 5-1 motion, give us that, like, as we talked about, nothing in music happens on its own. It's all happening in a context or in relation to other things going on. When we have this chromatic scale, it's like, where did we come from? Where are we going? And in this case, we came from C sharp minor, and we're going to end with a cadence 5, 7 to 1 on C sharp minor. So let's look a little bit more in detail at this cadence. I've highlighted the F sharp above the 5 chord. That's in green there. That's scale degree 4, resolving down to scale degree 3. Now let's listen to this. So you can kind of hear there the 5 chord, which is G sharp major, G sharp, then G sharp, B sharp, D sharp, and F sharp, G sharp 7, dominant 7, right? To 1, C sharp minor. And you can hear that 7th, the scale degree 4, 4, 4, 3, contains all that motion of the 5-7 chord moving to the 1 chord, defining the key and coming to that place of rest at the end of the cadence. And we see the other voices doing very similar motion that we saw in the other cadences that we looked at. We see in the bass the typical boom 5, and then it actually comes up from the lowest note, right? Boom 5. But you can also see that at the bottom of that chord, it also comes down from G sharp there. So you kind of have both coming and colliding like that. And same thing in the melody. You've got this chromatic melody. And then it ends with G sharp 5 and then C sharp 1. So you've got this kind of contrary motion of like that. 5-1 in both outer voices moving away from each other and landing on that final note in that way that feels conclusive. And then in combination with the 7th resolving down by step, the 4 to 3, the only one that we don't see clearly yet is where's the leading tone and how is that working? Well, the leading tone is here, right? Scale degree 7, B sharp. It's raised in C sharp minor and it's leading up, but Chopin leaves a note out. The tonic note of that last chord is just left out. Where we expect that leading tone to go up by half step, where we have that tendency, that expectation, it's almost as though, because that expectation is so strong, because so many composers wrote that, because that became built into the feeling of a cadence, he doesn't even need to literally have the next note sound, that our expectation, our imagination will fill in that blank for us. And I think there's something to that. But we can hear that leading tone 7, and we expect it to go here 1, but it doesn't resolve to C sharp. it's just left out. Okay, good. So I know I only talked about 2 different chords, 1 and 5, but I think we talked about more than that. We talked about how chords can relate to each other and how these relationships can form gestures. In other words, or progressions, or they can come together to sound like something that's flowing and not just like here's this chord, here's that chord, but something connected. And they become connected through these different things that we looked at, like voice motions, so that parallel motions feel one way and contrary motions feel another way. And, I encourage you to explore the different potential voice motions between chords. Like oblique is really interesting because it means that one note will stay the same. And if you have multiple chords that have a common tone, you can think about keeping that note the same and having the other voices move relative to it. So there's lots of interesting things that can happen with voice motions. We also talked about tendency tones, and tendency tones are just any notes that we expect to resolve in a certain way, or any motions in a chord that we expect to happen, because this is coming from classical music or coming from certain expectations in chords that just occurred so often in the same order that we have that built in as a tendency. But you can also think about tendency tones as even within a single piece, within the piece that you're composing. You can think of composing a tendency into your piece. Like usually when this note shows up, whenever scale degree 6 shows up, it usually in my piece goes down to scale degree 3. It has a tendency for scale degree 6 to go somewhere. And then that once you've built up that tendency, you can set up that expectation, have that context, and that'll be a tendency within your piece. And maybe other people will do it, and it'll become a whole style. And then we also talked about cadences, which are an example of a gesture, a multi-chord gesture that is a way of expressing some like a higher level concept, like endingness. And we also talked about expressing a beginning and different ways of bringing multiple chords together, having multiple chords flow together to express a higher level concept, like coming to a close. And we only looked at one example of cadences. We looked at how 5 can go to 1 and 5/7 can go to 1. Now there's other examples of cadences. Again, you can imagine if we just got rid of the 1 and the 5 chord, but like kept thinking about the relationships that are set up, we could use maybe any chords and try to establish cadences that way. And in fact, people have done that, and so we'll take a look at that in some future videos. And also what kinds of gestures and what kinds of chords can go on in the middle. If this is your beginning and this is your ending, what other kinds of higher level things can you express with combinations of chords or chord progressions? So stick around and we'll get to that next time.